Welcome to the Theotech Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Lim. Do you ever feel like you could be doing something more with your life? You may be comfortable following a safe, established career path, but maybe feel like your true calling is elsewhere. In today's episode, Henry Zhu shares about the leaps of faith he's taken in his career, from being a self-taught programmer to becoming the maintainer of the essential open-source project Babel. We also talk about how church cultures can encourage faith-based risk-taking so people are empowered to pursue their vocation. Henry is going to start us out by explaining what Babel is and why it's important.
First, I guess I'll briefly talk about Babel. And, it's a very technical project, but I think we can still talk about it in a non-technical way. It is referred to in programmer language as a compiler, but the normal word I would use is just a translator. Except that normally you would use this to translate, like Google Translate like, English to Spanish or Chinese or something. But this tool actually only converts programming languages. And even more specifically than that, it only translates one language to itself, which might sound really weird because you're like, why would you convert, like English to English, right? And it's because programming languages have versions. Unlike, English, technically English is changing all the time. I can create new words out of nothing. But with the programming language, it has to be defined. Someone has to code that you can type this symbol, like an and sign or something. And if it's not in the language, it'll just give you an error, right? But in English, you could say anything you want. No one's going to understand you, but there's no error. Programming languages will update over time, just like any other language. Like you can name a few, like Java or Python or Ruby. And there's going to be new syntax, which is, you could say, new words, new vocabulary that's introduced. And what happens is that every browser that you use has a specific version of JavaScript that it supports. And some of the browsers update regularly, like Chrome. But then Internet Explorer, for example, is really old and it has a fixed version of JavaScript. And so if you want to write that new version of JavaScript and you try to run that in Internet Explorer, load that web page, it will not work because it won't understand that new syntax or new symbol. It'll just give you an error and it'll be a blank screen. And so the thing is that engineers want to write new shiny stuff, just like anyone, right? You want to try out new stuff, or maybe that code is less code than if you wrote it before. And so they want to write the new code, but then they also have to support users that are on old browsers. So we create a tool that translates the new code into backwards compatible version of the old code.
Mm-hmm.
And that's exactly what a lot of people use now. Almost every single big tech company, a lot of websites all use Babel to translate their code. And you might not even know you're using it because it's so we call it low level, you don't have to know that it exists, but somewhere in there, it's probably being used.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I could go more, but
that's Babel in a nutshell. Yeah. For people who are not coders. Let's go ahead and talk about your journey, to shift from a software engineering career at Adobe to become the maintainer for this open source project.
There's a lot to go through, but actually I should go all the way back to saying that I did not major in computer science,
Wow.
But I had an interest in it. I did a lot of side projects, you could say. I went to some hackathons when that was still an early thing. I guess that's a huge thing now where it's kind of like marathon plus hacking, but not hacking as in bad things, but hacking it together, right? Exactly. So just you spend a weekend making an app or a website or something, and you usually work with people you don't know on something that you've never tried before. You try a new language. So I did a bunch of those, had a little bit of experience there, made my own side projects, and that's how I kind of learned, basically taught myself. I did major in industrial engineering, it is engineering, and a lot of it's related to math and statistics. So it did have to do with programming, but a lot of it was Excel or data analysis.
Mm-hmm.
But I kind of wanted to do programming web development or just other kinds of programming, not necessarily data science, which is more of a thing now. And so I kind of just applied to companies there. I didn't get into all the Googles and whatever when I graduated, so I just found a random job where I'm from in Georgia. And then one of my coworkers introduced me to open source in the sense of telling me that I can actually get involved. I used a bunch of open source, but I didn't ever think to even look at the code or who works on it or any of that stuff. And then when I was I found someone in real life that actually contributes to open source. And he was yeah, you can just do it. And then for me, that was enough for me to even look into it. I think that's not enough for most people, because I wouldn't recommend that's like how you get started. That doesn't make sense. Like, just someone telling you you can do it is enough to do it. And sometimes it is. Like, you just need that encouragement from someone in real life to be like, hey, this is possible.
Mm-hmm.
And then I didn't even need his help till I just figured it out. And there was a lot of frustration because you look at the GitHub and how to actually contribute, and you have no idea how anything works. Eventually, I found a project that we call a linter. And a code linter is similar to the translator, except it just tells you when you have errors. So it's sort of like a spell checker, like linting with your clothes. So you're trying to get rid of the lint. So it's sort of like getting rid of errors in your code. So I found one of those, and I thought it was so interesting that you could write code to help you write better code, right, essentially. So I got into that, and it's simple stuff like, add a space here, or make sure you name this a certain way, just certain things, sort of like spell check. And so I got involved in a project that did that. And then after like half a year or a year of doing that online with just people in my free time, someone that was on the project reached out to me that worked at Adobe, and he emailed me and said, hey, Henry, we've been essentially working together for a long time now, and we think you're really cool. Do you want to just come work at Adobe? Basically, I just got an email out of nowhere. Hey, do you want to work here? And at that point, I already almost gave up at working at one of these big tech companies. And then I had to be like, well, where is it? And they're like, New York. I was like, oh man, I want to go to New York, because I had all these just, I don't know, negative assumptions about New York. But I think I had this. That was back then where I didn't really know anything about open source. I just thought it was cool to like help people and stuff. Like, I use this thing. Just a very generic feeling of like, that's cool, I want to help people, which is good. And I thought that if I worked there, that they would let me do it more, or maybe even at work, because they found me through open source. They use open source. Of course, they're going to let me do it, right? So I was like, all right, I'll at least do the interview. And then I thought it was great. I didn't have to do the whole whiteboard thing, which is great. And then eventually I got it. And I decided to just leave. That was already hard because I would rather stay near home, and I don't want to move, do my own thing, all that stuff. But did that. And then essentially after I started working at Adobe, I was trying to do open source. They didn't really let me do it at work because, company, they want you to do work for the company. And it was in that time I found about Babel, and I realized that Babel and the thing I was working on is very similar. Like, one's about like translating code, and the other one's about like giving errors. It's like very similar concept. So I got involved, and then eventually like the person that started the project got burnt out of open source. And there's a lot of reasons for that, because you're doing it for free, people getting at you. I'm sure this is actually very similar to serving in church. Like, you're doing this thing for free and for fun, and then people are like, why don't you fix this bug? Or how did you add this thing? And like, online's even worse, because they're just random people around the world that have no idea who you are. And at any point in time, they can just ask you for stuff. And then you feel an obligation to help them. So you feel guilty, right? And so you might feel guilty for serving in church, like, because people are pressuring you to do that.
Yeah. Wow.
So I think there's that, and then you're not making any money, so you feel like it's even okay. And then you can even talk about the fact that only people that have free time are able to do this usually, right? If you have kids, or you're just busy, or you have other interests, then you feel like you have to do open source. And other people are like, if you don't do open source, then it looks bad on your resume, and then there's a whole culture of that, which is not good. But eventually, I somehow got involved by accident, by just contributing. They mentioned me on the blog post. They're like, hey, good job, Henry. Like, you helped us. And I basically did nothing. I felt like I did nothing.
That's a smart leader there. He knows how to get buy-in on you. It's like, oh.
I know that now too. Like, you just, like, I know that saying that, because it worked for me, like telling people good job and giving them responsibility, it does help. But I don't want to guilt people into doing it. It is like a trick, because it's like, once you get it, hey, haha, like, now you got to maintain this thing forever.
Positive reinforcement.
It works.
Yeah.
But I think for us, it's like, how do we create a culture where you should feel okay with stepping back? And I think that's an important question on how to even do that from like the cultural point of view, in the sense of like, I should feel free to stop working, because then that would help other people. I think I see that in work, where like, if the boss is always at work, everyone is just going to stay. Or if they work on the weekend, then everyone's going to work on the weekend. Or they never take vacation, no one's going to take vacation, right? That sort of thing. Yeah, I know I've been talking a lot. But basically, I got involved, and then I started working at work. I even asked my boss if I could do it at work, and they were very nice because they understood the value of open source because they did open source. They let me do it half
Mm,
time at work. Yeah,
wow.
I mean, I can get into the fact that when I asked them, I was like actually very scared of them, and they're really nice
Mm,
people. I was really scared of asking them because I just didn't know if that was okay. I was like shaking when I was there, which is really weird. And yeah, but then they were able to let me do it, which was great. But long story short, though, I after like a year of that, I realized that I still felt kind of isolated at work. Not because people were treating me in that way, but the environment was such that the company is about the company. And if I'm the one thinking about this project half the time, and then other time about this other stuff, I can't. I don't feel like not free, but just like it's not like no one. No one needs to care about this open source project, but I feel like there's no team. Like I'm doing half my time on this thing, so it's not anyone's fault. It's just that I just didn't feel great like doing my own thing, and then feeling also guilty that I'm not spending my other time on this other stuff that I should be caring about because everyone else is thinking about it, right? And so that led me to a place where I'm just like, I almost feel like it's better if I just decided to not do open source work anymore or figure out how to do it full time. That was my feeling. I just felt not good inside about it. And that made me feel worse, like this anxiety that you have, this cycle of like, well, no one did anything wrong. I didn't really do anything bad either. It was just the situation kind of sucks. And I was like, shouldn't I feel grateful that I can even do it half time? And I should. And I am. But I asked them about the full time. No, they said no. They couldn't justify it. I even went up like to a higher level to ask them about that somewhere within the company. Said no. I didn't see any other companies that would do it. And then eventually, there's another open source maintainer, Evan Yu. He maintains this project called Vue.js. That's a very popular framework that people use. He actually quit
yep.
his job and he was working before and then he decided to just quit. And he did it like I think it was at least a year or almost 2 years before that. And I even talked to him and then eventually I mean he told me to quit like immediately, like a long time ago. He said just do it. And I was just so scared. Um,
Really?
and eventually I was like, yeah,
Just
I
do it.
think, well, one of the reasons why I decided to do it was most people, I mean, even for him, like you kind of make a Patreon or like a Kickstarter sort of thing where like you have a sustainable revenue and then do it. But I guess, I mean, this is a lot of my privilege too, but I felt like if I waited to have enough money to feel like I was uncomfortable, then I would never do it because I would never make that much money. I almost felt like you kind of have to go all in. Sometimes you have
Yeah.
to go all in to figure out whether it's worth it. And then I figured that I'm in a position also, luckily, that I could just go back to my old job probably because I have a good relationship with them. Like I could do that, or I could just get my job. Like, why is that even a bad thing? And so I feel like if you're in a position to take that, then I'm
Yep.
like, why shouldn't I do that? I'm just scared just because I'm scared of the future.
I
That's one part
see.
of it. So that's very practical. And, the whole like, what are you gonna do about money and all these things, insurance, and yeah, I don't know anything about that. Taxes, having to make a business, like all that stuff. I didn't know anything about that, and I figured,
So just to be clear, are you supported on Patreon
yeah,
now
uh
and
huh.
other mechanisms
So
like that?
Patreon
Open
is the
Collective
one that a
or
lot of people use
yeah.
for like artists and people, all that. I have that, but then GitHub has their own one now for like open source maintainers. So I have that, and then also Open Collective, which is for like the project itself, which is Babel. So like we ask for donations from companies,
Hmm.
and some companies are doing that. And then right now we're trying to also essentially raise money so we can pay other people too. It's sort of weird. It's sort of like a church where we're like raising money for missions or something, or just tithing, I suppose. But the tithing is from companies, and we're not forcing them to do it. But like hopefully some people will. And then also trying to pay other people, not just the pastor, right, or like the people on staff, but like volunteers and stuff. But that's hard too. That's a whole
Yep.
discussion. But my other
Yep.
reason for leaving was I felt like I could be kind of even what we were saying earlier. Like I feel like I could be more myself by being on my own, and it's going to be way harder. The whole like big fish in a
Mm.
small pond versus small fish in a big pond sort of thing, of being in a company and trying to do stuff there. The point was that like I felt like over time when I started doing open source more, I realized a lot of the things I wanted to explore in open source were not really about the code. Meaning like I don't really care about like adding new features. Like I like that, but like that wasn't the thing that I'm like excited to be thinking about and seeing how do we like move forward, right? We can always add new features. Anyone can write some
Yeah.
code, but really it's like, how do we make open source more inclusive for people, or friendly, or sustainable for people in terms of money, or adding more people to be involved, or all these things, right? Those things I think were more interesting to me as I got involved. And that was a transition between being a participant, contributor, or just consumer of open source to becoming a maintainer. And that's not like a monolithic thing either. It's just, I think that a maintainer cares about the future of the project. They care about stewardship. They care about a lot more than just that. Normally they're like, I have a bug, can you fix it? That's just caring about their thing. And they don't have to care about the project. I'm just saying that when you become a maintainer, you start looking into other people's problems and to try to help them. And that's very similar to the church setting too, where I'm like, a lot of people in church, you kind of just show up and that's fine. Especially in the beginning, you don't even know, this environment's so weird. I don't know anyone. We're all singing different things, doing all these different liturgies and stuff. And so, but there is a point where maybe you're there enough time that you feel like, hey, I can have a different role, or I can be involved. I can participate, right? I want to be more of a, producer than the consumer. And maybe I can be a better consumer by being a producer, right? Those kinds of things. And so I felt like if I just worked, say I did find a place that let me do open source full time, ultimately, it's still for the company. Even if everyone's nice, it's going to be for that, and you're going to have to add features that for that. I just feel like it's a lot of work to try to justify doing anything else other than just writing some code or something.
Yeah, and that's the difference between an entrepreneur and just an employee, right? The entrepreneur has the freedom, but also the responsibility to explore things and to take risks and experiment and everything, whereas the employee tends to have a very defined job role that they just carry out in exchange for their compensation. But that's a big shift, and I do think that it's just interesting to tie it to faith and walking by faith. Like, there's nothing wrong with being an employee. There's nothing wrong with being an entrepreneur, but there's certain ways that being an entrepreneur stretches your faith that being an employee does not, I think. And I inbuilt into the Christian faith is an unleashing of people to take risks with their life for the sake of the gospel, and maybe big or small, but it's not when it's not in a, I think, dysfunctional form, it actually unleashes people to be creative, to take risks and everything else like that. Because at the end of the day, God's taken away all the risk from us. We have zero risk, because even if we get killed, God raises us from the dead. Now, I talk about it soundingly flippantly, maybe, but that is our faith. Like, we have the conviction and the belief that because Christ rose from the dead, we also will. And if we take that seriously, we can also be a little bit, quote unquote, flippant about taking risks, in the sense that we know God's going to take care of us. And if we're doing it for the sake of the kingdom, then that's actually what we're called to do.
We should question whether we do take our faith seriously a lot of the time, because I feel like I don't so much. And I don't know, that was just like one small way of me having faith. That it was a leap of faith for me to quit it. And there was a lot of, you could say, backups, I guess, in terms of like knowing, even if it wasn't conscious, that I could get another job and all these things. But whatever it is, there's a risk of the unknown. And I think whenever there's an unknown future and we decide to do it, I think that is active faith, of knowing that I don't know if everything's going to be okay, but I think that God has my back. Hopefully, even if and having my back could mean a lot of different things, right? It could fail, and then at least I get my job back or something, or I don't get my job, but I have to trust that whatever decision I make, it's going to work out somehow. And I think that was another thing of I felt like I could be more myself in terms of being a Christian by not working at a company. Of course, that has its own things, but even I go back to this idea of thinking differently because I'm in a different environment or different position, like thinking of myself as an employee versus thinking of myself as an independent open source maintainer. Like, why did I end up making that podcast it's called Hope and Source with my friend Nadia, and it's about faith in open source. I feel like if I was still at the company, I don't know if I would even thought of that, or I thought it was a suggestion to make. So I think it's almost like there are thoughts that we can't think until we get to this different position. And so I felt like that validated my decision to feel like, okay, I think this is worth pursuing. And then even after, you can always decide to go back too. So it's at least give it a shot. But then now it's like, oh, it's been a year. Now it's been 2 years. Do I still want to do this?
Uh-huh.
Is it worth it? Like those kinds of things. Because they're like all the time you have to deal with all these things. And it's like, why don't I just work at a company? It would be so much easier. But like, why am I don't want to live my life just because it's easier or comforting. That's not my like those are good things, but that shouldn't be like our
Yeah.
goal, right? Like I'm not trying to.
Yeah. And I think with what's going on worldwide and in the United States, like that kind of complacency is becoming more and more untenable. It's like we could be ignorant and just try to be comfortable, but it's pretty obvious that things are not going to be back to normal and status quo. Like everything is shaken up, everything's disrupted, which is exactly what you were saying. A great time to ask those questions about why am I doing what I'm doing? And as Christians, it's kind of like a discernment of remembering who we are in Christ, our identity, and then also discerning our vocation. Like, what is God actually calling us to do? And how is God calling us to use our gifts in the service of the kingdom and to serve others? And to be open to the possibility that it could be something very different than what we're doing right now. It could be. It might be the same, but it might be different. I've been going through the same questions with myself and Theotech and what we do, and it's been a pretty interesting process, and kind of because that feeling also of just like God is like, what am I even doing? Is there even a point? Like we care about language diversity. I believe it's something God wants, but with everything that's happening, it feels like nobody else cares. Like, should I even work on this? And the desire for comfort is there too. It's like, well, maybe it's simpler just to have a steady paycheck and go work. But what happens then is that this kind of ties into what we said earlier. Then I kind of lost the chance to exercise my faith, I lost a chance at least, because I've seen how God has come through in ways that I never predicted or expected. And that was only because I was still in a mode that required kind of walking by faith day by day for daily bread. and it wouldn't have known it that way, except for the fact that I was in that position. So it made me think kind of Israel in the wilderness for the 40 years, where it said that, what was it? God gave them manna from heaven so that they would learn that they live by the word of God, not by bread alone, right? That it's actually God who literally provides everything that they need. It wasn't because they farmed. It wasn't because they grew and they worked hard. It was literally God. And when they entered the promised land, the manna stopped, because that was like the purpose of the manna, was for them to learn to trust God for everything. And then it was through their work and laboring and cultivating the land. But the core lesson never kind of went away, the essential thing. And I feel like that's what I'm learning in my season as an entrepreneur is it's a test of faith over and over again, but it's like literally God provides everything.
I also think that, I mean, the thing we were talking about earlier, but struggling with just like, I want to figure out how do you encourage other people to do those kinds of things without making it look like, I'm doing this thing, you should do the same thing, or you have to do it this way, or anything like that. And I think that part is difficult because, what is the difference between encouraging someone to do something versus feeling like you're pressuring them or coercion, or, the difference between evangelism and proselytizing, or like, how do you differentiate these things? And you can talk about ambition of like, some people are too ambitious in the sense they care, it's about them. And other people are too scared of being ambitious because they're afraid. And so they're like not living up to the potential that God's put in their life. And so we should be ambitious, not for ourselves, but for what can happen, right? And I don't know how you get around, like, it's sort of like the whole city versus, if you even want to make that comparison, like city or like suburb sort of feeling, where like I know that in suburbs I feel like I don't want to do anything. No one else is doing anything. Everyone's just kind of doing whatever. That's not true. It's just that feeling. And that's why like the typical stereotype of people wanting to go to the city because they feel like everyone around you is just like kind of doing whatever. I don't know. That's not true, but like that's how you feel. And then you go to the city, and then the opposite happens, where it's like everyone's just trying to like make a lot of money, or that typical thing. And then you're like, what happened to just being like people? And like, how do you have both people that really care about making change, but then they also don't take themselves too seriously, which I think I do all the time. I don't know, just like creating a culture where like the New York City culture has its own thing. And I think that there's an attractiveness to that, is that it's good. But you can use the metaphor of the city of man and the city of God, right? Like where is that?
Yeah, I think that, we don't have answers. A lot of really good questions. The only thought that I have is that believing that people have so much potential doesn't mean that we have to tell them what they have to do or be. It just means that we believe in them, that there's so much more that they could do, so much that God's given them to do. And our only aim is to help them to be faithful towards God, not towards us, with all the capacity that God's gifted to them, and to use it righteously. And what that actually practically looks like, I think that it's possible to create a culture, kind of like how when you stepped out of the corporate culture, you felt like so much more was possible. That culture is what people need to experience, even if they can't get it at their workplace or in their home. If our churches had that culture, that would be powerful. If our friendships and our fellowship had that culture, that would be powerful. Maybe that is the gift that we as the church can be for people, is to create that kind of culture for them when they can't experience it elsewhere, right? In some ways, that is the kingdom counterculture that our churches were to exhibit, for exhibiting the kingdom of God to the world. But we fall so short because we end up getting kind of just absorbing, I think, the status quo so easily instead. But maybe, because then it's an environment of conscience where people, like, it's facilitating people discerning God's call on their life. It's not telling them you have to be this or you have to do that. And that is how the Spirit operates too, because the Spirit works in each individual person and bears witness through people, but doesn't
encourages,
doesn't coerce. Well, I really enjoyed speaking with you today, Henry. Hope to have you again on the show. Thank you for sharing.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Theotech Podcast. If you'd like to hear more of Henry's stories and ideas, check out the podcast he hosts with Nadia Agbol at hopeinsource.com. If you'd like to help us share stories at the intersection of theology and technology, become a patron at patreon.com/theotech. Thank you to all of our patrons for making this episode possible. God be with you.